Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sprint 222 review. This was a normal 2-week sprint. Let's get started. I'll start with the overview, Jeffrey on the UI, Adam on providers, Joe on the platform, and Keenan will do the API. This sprint, there were 98 PRs merged, and it was a pretty healthy split between bugs and enhancements and tests. And I forgot to mention it on the last sprint review, but we released Petrosian 1. You can see the blog post there and read all about all the features that we got. A big thanks to the whole community and the entire team here for getting that out the door. We're starting work on the Quinteros release, and you should see some of our work in the open source. And over to Jeffrey on the UI.
Hey, in the sprint, we merged a total of 8 PRs into the UI Classic repository. Out of these, 4 PRs were related to bug fix, 3 PRs were for enhancing features, and 1 for technical debt. I can explain about them in the following slides. Recently, we made a few additions to implement the embedded workflows in the service catalog forms. And for doing that, we moved some of the lines of code to separate files, which unfortunately led to a few failing specs. Adam resolved this issue by adding a few safe navigation methods. Next slide. David had successfully resolved the remote console issue. In the screenshot, you can see how small the console used to be. David introduced the missing JavaScript asset files into the pages where the styles were originally defined to solve this issue. Next slide. Gilbert made a fix for the permission errors in the catalog pages. If a user account with a role that only has permissions for catalog items and then click on the catalog items table, you'll get to see this dialog error message. Gilbert made few changes in the asset privileges method in the catalogs controller to solve this problem. Next slide. The Ansible credential form pages was not displaying some values in their respective input fields. These fields were directly sourced from an API response, and the required data was wrapped within a separate object, causing few confusions in the form schema itself. After expanding this object, the missing values were correctly assigned to the initial form values, and you can see these values being displayed into these input fields. Next slide. The workflow status list was introduced on the service request show page, and here is how it looks like now. Multiple workflows can be displayed in blocks, and each block presents the current status, the workflow names, and then a list of items. We plan to make a few improvements in an upcoming PR. Next slide. This was a follow-up PR to display the repository name along with the workflow names in order to avoid some confusions to the users. This change has been made in the dialog editor's drop-down fields, options, model box. A dependent PR in the UI component was also made to make this change happen. Next slide. David has added the new credential mapping form to the embedded workflows page. Next slide. That's all from the UI side. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Jeffrey. For core this sprint, we added shared specs for pause and resume actions on EMSs. So we have a set of shared specs in core, and then we've gone through and about a third or a half of the providers we have calling into those specs, and we're working on covering the rest of them. Basically, this covers making sure that we catch all the child managers and everything is behaving consistently, since previously it was pretty sporadic in terms of what was covered. There was a hard-coded set of providers that core was testing by itself, and now only the tests are in core, and all of the providers are responsible for implementing them, so it should have better test coverage for all of those, making sure that the pause and resume is consistent across all of the providers. For Amazon, we updated the list of instance types again, and for IBM Cloud, Jason fixed a missing package.json metadata that was causing issues with some JavaScript building. IBM Power VC, Jay fixed a provisioning issue with catalog provisioning where the source VM ID for allowed templates wasn't being set properly. It was working for classic provisioning, but not for service catalog provisioning. Next slide. Power VC, we updated Yarn to fix builds on S390X. For Kubernetes, we removed the ability to add new Prometheus alerts endpoints. So the Prometheus alerts manager was only available on OCP3. It's been removed on OCP4. And since we no longer support OCP3, we're in the process of removing all this old code. So first step is to not allow people to add new ones. And then following up, we're going to be deleting the manager and all the associated code for that. So we should have that coming up shortly. For Nuage, Brandon fixed an issue with XLab Galaxy roles pointing to an invalid repo URL. They had renamed their GitHub repo at a certain point with underscore verse dash, and it was causing the roles to point to the wrong one. Galaxy doesn't do the same thing that GitHub does with the auto redirects, and so that was causing the build to fail while we were pulling the roles from the content directory. And we also, for OpenStack and Nuage, fixed Qubit Proton installation for running on CI. We were pulling in packages from a newer Ubuntu repository, and the repo was deprecated in favor of a newer one. So since it wasn't an LTS version, there was only a short period of support, and so the packages were gone, but it was a simple fix to point to the newer version of Ubuntu. Going forward, once the version of Qubit Proton that we need is in an LTS version, we shouldn't have to worry about this, which should be pretty soon. Next slide. For VMware, we bumped RVVMOMI 2 to pull in update 2 support for vSphere 8. We also added sub-event type parsing for some new tasks that were causing us to not properly classify events coming from VMware's container native storage, or sorry, it's cloud native storage, but it's for VMware containers. I don't know who's naming stuff over there, but this is causing them to just look like generic events, which is making it harder to blacklist these specifically. So we added that to make it easier to blacklist that particular event for customers that have that issue. And Keenan was working and fixing some issues with the network manager on the VMware vCloud provider. We were delegating zone to parent, which was causing all kinds of problems with saving. So we just keep the zone ID in sync, and we don't need to delegate the association at all. That just works normally. For workflows, we now enabled embedded workflows by default, and so there's still a prototype flag, but it defaults to true for enabled. We now pass the namespace to the Flow Kubernetes runner so that we create the pods in the same namespace that ManageIQ is installed into as opposed to default. We are now running workflows asynchronously on an automation worker, which allows us to have finer grain control for the Kubernetes security context that we're running under. And we also now pass the ManageIQ API URL into the workflows in global context so that your ASL files don't need to hard code the API URL. They can get that dynamically. And that is it for providers. Over to Joe.
Thanks, Adam. For platform enhancements and improvements, Brandon was busy this sprint. He moved certificates for Podify from /root to /etc PKI TLS. He also added Podified RBAC for the new automation worker that Adam just mentioned. He also simplified dependencies in Podified and updated some Go dependencies. And finally, I added a tool to split up the EMS deletion into batches of much smaller queue messages to avoid some timeouts and high memory usage. Next slide. For platform bugs, Brandon reverted the lockdown to a specific UBI 8.8 image as the upstream images were corrected. Jason dropped the S390X workaround we used in RPM build now that we're on Yarn 4. Keenan added a data migration, and he refactored how we remove Vim strings to also remove them from the MIQQ args column. I added the ManageIQ ManageIQ user to the allowed UIDs for the SSSD configuration. This was needed after we stopped running as root. Keenan removed the MIQ LDAP to SSSD executable as part of the removing that deprecated feature. Brandon updated the container HTTPD and it dependent RPMs to the latest release versions. He also removed the work we did to build Postgres 10.23 ourselves, as that's now available upstream. And I fixed the Zitework loader issue where ManageIQ gems pending was now using Zitework, but SmartState wasn't correctly loading the gem loader file. That's it for the platform. On to Keenan and the API.
Cool. So a smaller to get the credentials mapping that Adam had mentioned for the workflows, we are allowing the workflows to work, and also changed our ability to remove passwords. The workflows, sorry, the credential mapping doesn't really have passwords in it. It just says where it's going to get the password from. The old code filtered this out. So Adam added the functionality to actually display the mapping correctly. On to Jason.
All right, and that's it for our Sprint 222 review. The next Sprint review 223 will be on October 18th at the usual place and time. And as always, I'd like to thank the presenters today and thank everyone in the community for all their help. Thanks, everyone.